Hello everyone, this is Charles Joe with Ledgerback, and I am the instructor for the Introduction to Data Cooperatives course. And so for this video, I'm just going to give a really short overview and just talk about some particular points from the readings for Lecture 3, the case for data cooperatives. Once again, the Introduction to Data Cooperatives course can be found on the Ledgerback Academy website at learn.ledgerback.xyz. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, you can send an email to ledgerback@gmail.com. Send a direct message to Ledgerback on Twitter to the handle @Ledgerback. Or you can post a message on the Ledgerback forum under the Introduction to Data Cooperatives thread. With that said, I'll get started here talking about the readings. And once again, I recommend completing the readings before watching this video. This will be much more helpful, and majority of this video has really just been helped to focus on particular points and clarify certain things. All right, so here's the outline for the slides. It covers the required readings. Once again, hopefully you've already done the readings before you've come to watch this video. Alright, so first reading, this one's kind of a really important paper when it comes to describing data cooperatives. As you can see, Alex Penland, very big proponent of data cooperatives and really data stewardship. And so this kind of like a seminal paper about how we can use data cooperatives for personal data management and trying to decentralize it. So first point, what's the impetus for data cooperatives? We have new questions around concentration of economic power in the information/data economy, raising the need for collective action. In other words, a Gilded Age 2.0. As you can see with many of these articles talking about the need for new forms of data stewardship. A lot of them also provide a historical analogy. So with data trust, you have a historical analogy to the feudalism. You have a similar one here. Don't necessarily have a feudalist system, but to the Gilded Age of the really the late 1800s, early 1900s, where we did have large concentration of economic power, and that's the time which led to the development of antitrust legislation. And so you'll see this historical analogy come up pretty often, and it is actually pretty helpful because it gives us kind of a roadmap to some solutions, especially regarding collective forms of solutions that can be developed to address some of these issues in the data economy. All right, moving on to the data cooperative definition. Definition here is the voluntary collaborative pooling by individuals of their personal data for the benefit of the membership of the group or community. Once again, really importantly, this paper is specifically talking about personal data, so it doesn't really mention non-personal data. Additionally, the motivation for individuals to get together and pool their data is driven by the need to share common insights across data that would otherwise be siloed or inaccessible. So this definition pretty much tracks with the other definitions of a data cooperative. Really people coming together to pool their data and to get benefits from the data. Once again, it's not necessarily monetary. It's primarily to get the insights from the data. But if there are monetary benefits, that's okay, but it's just not the be-all and end-all. So that's something you'll see kind of pretty often in these definitions of data cooperatives, and they'll pretty much track the same way. Yeah, and then the authors provide a short case study regarding the income of ride-sharing drivers. It's pretty similar to the problem solution statement you'll probably see for driver's seat cooperative. So the case studies, it's really tough for drivers to compare their incomes across similar routes, areas, and distance. Perhaps a lack of information regarding how the algorithms on these ride-sharing platforms actually work and how they allocate work and allocate uh, rewards as well. And then they also mention how passengers themselves also probably don't have a lot of information regarding where the average fees in the city. So that would be a good example for a data cooperative business that could help provide insights to rideshare drivers, but also to riders on how this rideshare transportation system actually works. Okay, move on to the next topic. Key parts of a data cooperative. So this paper talks about three specific parts of a data cooperative. Individual members own and control their personal data. So even though they can store some of the personal data in the cooperative, the ownership of it remains with the individual. So you could kind of consider the data cooperative to be a data store in addition to a personal data store. And that's something that gets mentioned a little bit more in that cooperative ecosystem, which is the next topic. So second key part, fiduciary obligation to members. So the cooperative has a fiduciary obligation, which means that's acts in the best interest of the members. One thing that's also a really important part to ensure that the accountability mechanisms ensure that the steward has to be working in the interest of the actual data suppliers, which here would be the members. And then third key parts, it's got to be a direct benefit to members. Once again, as I said, it doesn't necessarily solely need to be monetization of data, but really the most important thing is you have to share insights. So people need to get some real benefits from this data sharing, and not just solely monetization. Because even if you monetize, you might not necessarily get the insights from the data. So that's something to always keep in mind. That's what benefits are we trying to actually give to people through a data steward. All right, moving on to the data cooperative ecosystem. So if you've read the paper, you saw the graphic describing the entities in the data cooperative ecosystem. You also have three main entities. You have the data cooperative as a legal entity. Secondly, you have the individuals who make up the membership and elects the leadership, in other words, support directors. And then you have the external entities who interact with the data cooperative, referred to as queriers. So these would be your data users. The queriers can be the data users, but it could also be other data intermediaries you interact with. Pretty much anyone who wants the data, but it might not necessarily be direct use, because a data user would technically be a direct user of the data. It could be just a data intermediary, or someone who provides data science services. So they are using that, but not necessarily in the same way. But those would all really be referred to as queriers. Yeah, and as you can see in the graphic, which makes it a lot easier to understand. Once again, I really do recommend looking into readings before watching this video, because it'll just make more sense. As you can see in the graphic, you can see that all the members have their own personal data stores, while the Carver also has a personal data store for all the members. Once again, going back to my point, so that's how you ensure that individuals maintain their ownership of the data, so they can share it with the cooperative, but they can also take it back to their own personal data stores. So this way, the cooperative itself pretty much just handles, some part of the storage, but most importantly, handling the querying from third parties. And as you can see, that Carve handles a lot. So consent management, algorithm management, allocation management, key management, identity and access management. So it's really like a good amount. But really, at least from this paper, what you see is really that the queriers query the data cooperative, and the data cooperative queries, gets in contact with the member, and then the member gets responds, and this could be automated or it could be per instance regarding how the member wants their data used, and that curve responds on the member's behalf. So yeah, that's pretty much how it goes there. And then there's also a really nice graphic showing how consent management would work with user managed access. Kind of just going over the same thing I just talked about. A member can all set their consent policies or access policies, and then the cooperative just executes on that. So query would go to that cooperative. The cooperative would ensure that the member's access policy is followed, and then if the data gets used, alert the member, let them know, and once you get results, you just send that to the querier. So once again, do take a look at the graphics, because they are very helpful in trying to understand the data cooperative ecosystem. And another thing that's just actually really important to mention as well is that external entity could also, like I was saying, it's not necessarily that has to be a data user. It could just be external information technology, infrastructure provider. So that could also be one of the third parties that cooperative interacts with. Of course, you would need an agreement, also a level agreement there, which can help preserve the privacy of members and prevent their data from being monetized by the service provider. So that's something to also keep in mind. And lastly, we have the MIT Open Algorithms approach. So in this approach, this pretty much a compute over data approach. So you would send the algorithm to the data instead of the data to the algorithm. And once the algorithm computes the result, you send the result back to the querier. So this way, the data never leaves its location. Always stays in the member's personal data store. And if you look at the consent management graphic, it pretty much kind of goes over this process. And so at least then, with this paradigm, the data never has to move, and this way, you don't have to necessarily worry about data leakage. The data being sent over to the data user, and now they have data, they might use it one time for the algorithm, but then they could use it for another thing, and then another thing, or sell it. So this way, the data itself never moves, and this is a little bit more secure way of storing data, ensuring that so once you use the data, it doesn't end up in multiple places. And it also makes consent management a lot easier, as shown in the consent management graphic. And another thing that also gets brought up, as well as that the data cooperative should also vet algorithms for safety. So having an improved list of algorithms and some things to worry about regarding safety. It's make sure the algorithm doesn't lead to bias, discrimination, privacy violations, and other unintended consequences. So that's regarding safe list of algorithms. This is something that also comes up in Thorsten Dittbar's podcast, which is in lecture 4 with Poly and their technical structure. So there's some actual implementation of this this conceptualization for personal data management in the world right now. So Parasol was very helpful in that regard. Yeah, I chose not to include the identity related algorithmic assertions. but it's a really good read and shows additional use of the data, especially the data cooperative. It's not just providing insights, but also anything, any identity related assertions which could be developed based on the data. And at least regarding the type of cooperatives which would be used here, the authors pretty much focus more on credit unions because they already have a lot of data, manage a lot of financial data, lots of personal information. So that could be a route into developing data cooperatives, is going through credit unions and then having them grow their capacity to store and manage member data. Okay, moving on to the next slide. The case for data cooperatives. Once again, looking at the impetus for data cooperatives. So here, there's a need for data stewards or intermediaries to help individuals have control over how their data is used and shared, because data is playing an ever larger role in everyday life. And also, regarding the increase of economic power. So pretty similar reasoning from the previous slide, and you'll see once again some of the similar historical analogy always coming up, but here it's more focused on the fact that just plays a much bigger role in life. And it's pretty similar to once again the historical analogy. And additionally, increase our understanding of the power and value of data we generate. So very close to the, though without mentioning it, this is very close to that analogy of the Gilded Age, but also to the feudalism, and really trying to ensure that people, understand the value of the data and have some control over how it's, how that value gets generated and captured. So pretty similar, impetus with other conceptualizations of data cooperatives. All right, moving to the second point, cooperative principles provide solid historical foundations for data steward development. The commonalities are really the cooperative principles of community benefits and educate, train, and inform. So community benefits, once again going back to what's the goal of having this data, is really to share insights. So the community benefits, pulling the data, getting insights, and hopefully these insights can improve people's lives. One way or another. So that would be the community benefit, but additionally it could also be for some altruistic uses or more public uses as well, so it could go beyond the members. And then to educate, train, and inform. That's to really help people understand the power and value of their data, so really giving them upon what understand data literacy, and additionally how valuable the data is, and even possibly techniques on how to gain insights from their data. So really a lot on the educate, train, inform side. Okay, then we move on to the data cooperative definition. Organizations that creates an environment for members to pull their data so that it can be used to further their collective aspirations. By doing this, members have more control over data about themselves. They can maximize the value that they produce, and they can redistribute power to the collective value achieved. Pretty consistent definition with other definitions of data cooperatives. Nothing here. It's necessarily quite drastically different. Though I would say importantly, this does focus a lot more on personal data. Yes, data cooperative it's not necessarily limited to just personal data. It could also be non-personal data. It just really depends on what you're trying to steward. Okay, moving on to the challenges. Because I think that's a really important thing to also discuss are the challenges that come along with a data cooperative. Because I've been talking about some of the benefits, some of the things we'd like to achieve with data cooperatives, but also got to talk about the challenges that come with them as well. So the first challenge is organizational and data governance. This is really interesting because you do have to take into account both of these things, and with the data cooperative paper we talked about in the previous slide by with Pentland as an author. He was talking much more about the data governance side, but not necessarily the organizational governance side. And that's something to keep in mind, is that you do have to address both with the data cooperative. So, in the article I mentioned 5 data flows which you would have to worry about as a data cooperative. You'd have to worry about member to cooperative. So that's mostly internal use. Data for internal use. So this is data comes from members to cooperative, member to member. So it's data shared between members, and this could be facilitated by the cooperative. Also federated. So it's between organizations, that have similar aims and data governance processes. Third party. So this is more the traditional one. So sharing between the cooperative and other third-party organizations through data sharing or licensing agreements. You have open data, which is creating a common open asset available to everyone. So those are 5 data flows you'll have to try to address with the data cooperative. Of course, also depending on what type of data you're trying to steward, because you might not necessarily have to deal with the open data if you're not trying to necessarily make an open data set or a data commons. So regarding those flows, you're going to need to have a means for addressing those data governance processes. So of course, you could use legal and social mechanisms to address that. And also mentioned in the articles that you're going to need 3 functions related to data. So you might need a separate entity to help manage the cooperative's data. Hopefully it aligns with the cooperative. And additionally, another function, there's 3 functions which are related to data, which that cooperative might have to deal with. Not necessarily have to deal with all 3, but these are 3 things that can come up. And I talked about the first point a little bit earlier, so I apologize for causing confusion there. So I'll just move to the second point. So this could be a data management function within an existing cooperative. Or third, a cooperative with its own purpose, which is just to collect, pool, process, and share data within the parameters sent by the members. So this goes back to the point that for a lot of tech-enabled cooperatives, data management is really a secondary function. So you might have a data cooperative, whose own purpose is just to collect, pool, process, and share data, while another technical cooperative, which is just trying to provide a digital service, probably going to have to deal with data one way or another, but that's not their explicit goal. I think I did talk about this in one of the previous videos, and I think the example I gave was with social.coop, which runs a Mastodon instance. So their goal is to run this Mastodon instance, but of course they're going to have to deal with user data and of course user generated content. And so in managing that data, they're not necessarily trying to run Mastodon to get this data, but they're going to have to manage it one way or another, but it's not their main goal. It's just it's got a secondary matter which they have to do to complete their primary goal, which is to run a Mastodon instance. And as I mentioned, the first point, you could also just partner with another entity to help manage your data. So this could be similar to what's talked about in the previous slide, with data cards being credit unions. So credit union could work with a information technology provider who would manage the data on the cooperative's behalf. That's also possible. So those are 3 primary functions you could expect for a data cooperative to deal with regarding data. Consent management is a big one, and it's something talked about in the previous slide. And so that's why I really recommend looking at the readings before watching this video. And if you get a look at that consent management graphic from the from the paper in the previous slide. That one pretty much kind of covers the same things. And at least, specifically mentioned in this article, you're gonna either need a delegation process or a body to do consent management. So that's gonna be something that needs to be handled as part of the data cooperatives. How do we handle consent? And I do talk about some of the basics of consent mechanisms. At least in the previous article, it's a little bit easier to understand this. And so it's really to set access policies and then have the branch of cooperative just execute on that. I think that's makes handling at least the basic consent mechanism a little bit easier, because from there you just leave it to the individual to set their own access control parameters, and then it's up to the cooperative just to execute on that. But how you want to design it, it's really up to the steward and the members in the data cooperative. Because it could be at an individual level, but additionally could also be at a collective level. So it's really up to the people in the data cooperative to decide. And finally, the last challenge, which is really the financial sustainability. That's always going to be a concern for any organization. So really the goal is, can we, return direct economic value to members through access to their insights. And so, an example given in the article was Driver Seat Co-op. So, with Driver Seat Co-ops, they, pull data from rideshare drivers, and then they anonymize data and, anonymize and clean up, and then sell it to states, government agencies related to transportation, and also to transportation-related companies. And then, once the data is sold, some of that value comes back to their driver's seat, but then also, if there's a return, that will go back to the rideshare drivers as well. And this in addition to providing the insights to rideshare drivers. So not only can they get an economic return, but they also get insights as well. So driver's seat is a pretty good example of providing both. Really, the importance of trying to provide insights and economic return to members of a data cooperative. And then they mentioned some of the costs, which there are a good amount. So first you have compliance. That's always going to be a cost. Infrastructure. How do you maintain your information technology? How do you develop your software, and how do you process your data? So those are costs right there. And of course, the human burden. Someone's got to be maintaining the infrastructure, and also the cooperative itself. So those are costs which should also be taken account in developing a data cooperative. And then he also mentions that for smaller data cooperatives, you could have reach sustainability from a subscription model. And so members directly contribute to the operation of the cooperative with the value derived from the ability to maintain and exchange data through shared insights or new sources created. And this mentioned a little bit more in the next lecture. Really with like poly, but that's pretty much kind of their models to go with the subscription, and also in the State of the Data Stewardship article, which should be in the next lecture, or it's in lecture 5. Goes over that a lot of these new data stewardship models generally use a subscription model to encourage people to stay and support the organization. Yeah, and then the conclusion of the of the article also mentions how trust versus scale cannot be ignored. Can you scale a data cooperative at the same time maintaining trust? So that's something to also think about, and that's something to mention for future research. And conversely, how can you set up and sustain a small data cooperative when scale is not required? It's not necessarily every data cooperative is going to be big. You have a lot of them are probably going to be small, and if it's small, how do we sustain that? And even then, when is scale actually required? Okay, moving on to the next slide. So here we have the potentials and challenges of the health data cooperative model. This paper really just kind of dives into health data cooperative model, and the authors, I'm pretty sure, some of the people who work at My Data Cooperative, which is data cooperative, more specifically for health data, up in Switzerland. It's a really interesting cooperative. So we'll start with the problem statements. We have data silos, and so as mentioned in the article, these are health data silos. So you have data trapped in different organizations, and bits are trapped in different organizations. You might not necessarily get all the insights that you need. It might lead to oversharing of data and the underuse of that data to create new insights. And so their solution, it's really help data cooperatives, HDCs, to make data available to society. So, the HDC, it makes data available to society, therefore you can escape these data silos, and you can have multiple people using the same data to create new innovations or just to do new research or find other ways to improve patient outcomes. So, it's really, really interesting. And then here we have the HDC definition. HDC as a health data bank. The account holders, also referred to as members, users, or citizens, can collect and store their health-related information, for example, from the EPR, fitness or sleeping apps, heart rate monitors, and glucose meters on their HTC account. So here, we're really talking about, pretty similar to how the first slide, in the paper, regarding personal data, personal data management by Alex Pentland, and I'm forgetting the co-author, but in the paper, Alex Pentland and I think Thomas Harjano, hopefully I didn't butcher their names. It's a very similar concept, and as you can tell just from the definition, pretty much you're expecting there to be some personal data stores, and in addition to that, you're having the data cooperative have its own data stores for members. So you have member data stores and personal data stores. That's what you can kind of just get from that definition. And with a personal data store, that just pulls in all this health-related information. And then moving on to the core principles of the HCC model. And sorry, I left a note in there. This will be cleaned up in the actual slides. Sorry about that. So ownership, once again, going back to what I was talking about the HCC definition. So ownership is going to be citizen driven. So, you expect members to have their own personal data store, and at the same time have equal interests in the HDC. And then when it comes to membership, everyone pays a similar price or membership fee to become a member and an owner or member owner. So once again, pretty much very similar to a cooperative. And then profit motivation, kind of tracking along with My Data Cooperative. It would also be a nonprofit. This way, that's any of the revenues from any projects just gets reinvested back into the platform. And this way, also to kind of alleviate some of those concerns with developing a dashboard kind of align incentives, especially regarding the commercial interests. At the same time, empower the interests of the individuals and communities who act as the data suppliers. So making sure that the dashboard doesn't necessarily try to monetize data from data suppliers in a way that could be harmful to the interests of the individuals and communities who act as data suppliers. Okay, moving on to the last one, which is the user interface. The agency has to provide third parties with data storage, visualization, analytics, options to obtain, process, and extract knowledge from relevant data. This is a pretty important part and also comes up in the first paper from Pelin and Harjano, this would refer really to the queriers, providing an interface for them so that they can actually get the data and generate knowledge from it. Okay, moving on to the next point, potential benefits. So I only really highlighted 3 of them because I feel as if this paper itself is pretty similar to the paper by Harjano and Pentland. So I only picked 3 of the potential benefits, but there are actually more mentioned in the paper. So if you want to read more about more of the benefits of an HDC, you can find it in the paper. So the ones I thought were pretty interesting were citizen empowerment. Once again, going back to that citizen-centered approach, having the members have their own personal data stores, and the data carve also have member data stores. But this way, members ultimately have control over their data. So they actually want to remove it from the HDC, they can, and they can keep it in their own personal data store. So this way, the data remains with the citizen and also remains portable as well. And also, it's really interesting point that he mentions that the willingness for people to share their personal health information increases when individuals have control over their own data and the information is anonymous. So by providing citizens with more control over how their data gets stored and shared, that actually will increase their willingness to share that data. So it's a pretty interesting point there, is that more control people have, the more willing they'll be to share it. Very interesting one. So that was some of the interesting parts about citizen empowerment. Okay, moving on to the knowledge benefit. Really, this benefit comes from the ease of data collection and participant identification. It's easier to disseminate the results of research, but you can just send the results right to the members who provide the data. And also additionally, this comes from just making data even just more available. Because the more available it is, the easier it should be to collect this data. And also for studies as well, the costs should actually go down. Because it should be easier to collect data and to run experiments. So that's also an additional thing as well, is that we can actually reduce costs for research by making the data more accessible. And also mentioned in this one, which is pretty similar, it's also like consent management. It's pretty similar to what's mentioned in the Pelin and Harjano paper. Members set access policies, and then you kind of just go from there. So I thought that was a really interesting one, and really does give the ability for some dynamic consent management. And I think that's just a really important part to mention with data carves as well. So that if you can give the consent management or user-based consent management, that really changes how we perceive data and how it could be stewarded, and also empowering the citizen. So, with the HCC, makes that more available. This can provide knowledge benefits, but also probably can also empower citizens. So it's you can provide multiple benefits for making the data more available through this HDC. And as I mentioned a little bit earlier, you can reduce costs and healthcare expenses, because the more digitized electronic health records, EHRs become, especially also making that more accessible, should be cheaper than to figure out what procedures to provide to patients, and should make it easier for people to understand their own condition and what treatments to look for. So this should help reduce the cost of healthcare expenses. All right, moving on to the challenges. Once again, this I really want to highlight in this lecture as well. It's not just the benefits, but what are the challenges of actually putting these models into practice. Because I think that's an extremely important part to keep in mind, is that even though these new forms of data stewardship are really innovative and really somewhat groundbreaking, really try and provide a solution, it's still there's always challenges to implementing solutions, and the better understanding we have with the challenges, the better we'll have of solving them and creating new and better models for data stewardship. Okay, so then regarding the challenges, you have privacy and data security concerns. Something you're always going to deal with. It's, how do you keep, how do you secure people's personal health data, but how do you also keep it private, so preventing it from being leaked? Anonymizing it so that people can't be personally identified later. So trying to make it harder for people to be personally identified. Also trying to prevent cyber or security attacks on the information technology providers and the databases. So it's a really important part to also keep in mind, as you're always going to worry about how do we provide privacy and security. And moving on to citizens' restraints. First ones do citizens even know that they can share data, and also, how do you incentivize citizens to actually, want to share their data? Considering that there are legitimate fears that could prevent that from happening. So as mentioned in the paper, even though I did mention earlier that if the more people have control over their healthcare data, the more willing to be to share. That's very true, but also there's still reasons why people might not want to, even if they could have more control. So mentioned in the paper, one of them could be increased risk of stigmatization or discrimination. So that's also something to keep in mind. That's so also keep in mind that the use of this data could always go ARI, could always end up harming citizens more than benefiting them. So that's all something to keep in mind. And really good additional one mentioned as well was just the cost of the membership fee. So how should the membership fee be structured to encourage people to actually join an HDC? So one-time membership fee as a subscription. It's something to think about as well. And even more than that, it's also what about the economic return? There's not an economic return. This could be interest or disincentivize people to become members of an HDC. Yeah, so that's something to also think about too. And also regarding access, how should people access it? This goes back to the membership fee, but it could also be you might make it free. Should it be free to get uptake? How do we get people to join? It was free, you might get more uptake. If you have a membership fee, that might reduce that. So something to something to think about. And then let's see. And additionally, it could lead to increasing health disparities as a result of digital divide, but not necessarily everyone has the ability to use digital tools and services. So the HCC itself could could say unintentionally increase health disparities. Of course, that's not necessarily the goal, but it could lead to that because not necessarily everyone has access to digital tools and services. All right, and then moving on to the last thing I wanted to talk about was just the commercial interest. And so this all this attention that you're always going to have with a data steward. Because with the HDC, we do want people to understand that their data is valuable. But of course, when you say valuable, one of the things people just have to think about is commercial value. So if we say it's commercially valuable, what's gonna stop a data steward from trying to create or get commercial returns on member data in an HDC? And if that is so, is that's in the interests of the actual members of the HCC. So that's something to always keep in mind, is that if since the data is commercially valuable, there could be a tension between the data steward and the members because the dashboard, wants to create some commercial value, but that commercial value could harm the actual members of the HCC. And I think an interesting example there could be like just the 23andMe, but I think that'll come up a little bit later in the slides. But yeah, something to always always keep in mind. And then I mentioned here, they do mention in the paper as well as that there's a need for more pilots of HCCs to really figure out the best ways of implementing them. But yeah, it's still in the early days, so it's still something to really work on. Okay, moving on to the next slide. Here we have WPS at Dart. And that's a really nice video. They're giving a really nice lecture. Oh, sorry, just presentation on data cooperatives. Yeah, so I split the slide into two parts, the presentation and post-presentation. Once again, I really do recommend watching the video. I think it's just like about an hour long, but it's really great, great watch. So, hopefully you found it interesting. So we're going to the presentation. This is mostly David just presenting on data cooperatives. As David mentions, data is valuable, but data is not the new oil. So it's not necessarily just purely economic. Once again, it can also have social benefits and provide benefits to particular groups or communities. So it's not, so the value isn't necessarily just purely economic. There's other things that can be used for, which can provide value. Yeah, and so in the video you should be able to see the slide talking about data's pretty much like an anti-rival good. Just data's non-fungible, non-rivalrous. It's highly networked and interdependent. Data's really only valuable in the aggregate. Individuals' data by itself is not very valuable, but in the aggregate, it's much more valuable. So that's something that we really want to point out. And she also mentions that really shouldn't have a rush to develop data marketplaces, because right now still individuals hold very little data, and individuals already have very little bargaining power with bigger firms. So as you mentioned, I'm not sure if she actually mentioned this, or it's probably just me, and my thought on it, it's pretty much a very similar impetus to the other slides. Is that it's kind of like the Gilded Age 2.0. Regarding the data economy. Okay, and then moving on to the data cooperative model. So that cooperative model, the goal is to provide accountability mechanisms for data generation, sharing, and use. And as you can see with if you've seen the video, you should see the cooperative model graphic. It's really a lot, but it's really, really good because it kind of shows how everything, how things are supposed to flow in that cooperative ecosystem. Pretty similar one to the one that Pella and Harjano made, but just a little bit more, including a little bit more stakeholders. So really interesting one. And so, as I said, the goal is to really provide accountability mechanisms for that. Also provide value to members and platform users. So for data users and for data suppliers, provide value to them, whether that be economic or not. All right, and then you can also try diverse governance models and democratic processes to meet the needs of different stakeholder groups. So that's really kind of a really big part there. Is that you can really try out lots of different governance models to meet the needs of particular stakeholder groups. And so that's why the data code can be structured to meet the needs of that particular group, rather than necessarily a cut and copy governance model, which might not necessarily meet the needs of particular stakeholders. Yeah, and then one of the things Divya mentions that she really wants to avoid a race to the bottom, where the least privacy preserving entity wins. So that's something that she thinks can be prevented with a data cooperative try to avoid that scenario. And let's see what else here. And also that's through a data carve model we can reposition the way we look at artificial intelligence, looking more as collective intelligence, since it's just based on a lot of scraping of 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 data and content that's available online, and that can help us with understanding how detect feasibility and and compliance in developing that. So I thought that's a really interesting point. And her goal really is that by reframing AI as collective intelligence, this will empower people to share data and use AI tools based on it, and really get them to realize that the data they've generated is valuable, and that they should be allowed to use the tools developed based on that data. All right, so moving on to the post presentation. A lot of this was the majority of the video, and it's really talks about like a lot of issues. So really do recommend to watch this video, and it's actually like very, very good. So first issue, financial sustainability. That's something that was previously discussed in the case for data cooperative slide. First and foremost, as Pam mentions, where all the funding come from for data cooperatives, how they generate revenue. Once again, big firms already have greater negotiating power, and generally only want to negotiate with other big firms. So how would a data curve tussle with bigger firms? And that's a really important part to always keep in mind, is that these are new firms entering an existing market. So how do they match up with the existing players? And one thing Pam mentions already is it's really the network effects problem. Really the fact that these big firms already have network effects, so it's really tough to change how they change their behavior. So that's something to always keep in mind as financial sustainability, and how can we possibly bargain with bigger firms. So once again, you have privacy and security concerns. I mean, they're pretty much the same as what was mentioned in the HCC article, and also in the case of data cooperatives article. Pretty much the same issues. Okay, and then moving on to data ownership view as suboptimal. This is a really important part mentioned in the videos, that if we recommend that people own their data, like what's that actually mean? What's it mean to own data? So at least here in the U.S., data is not protected by intellectual property law, IP law. So since it's not protected by IP law, how do you legally protect your data? One of the things mentioned was possibly just using trade secrets law, because that's kind of what you're doing. But that's a really important thing to keep in mind, is that there's a lot of data ownership, but we have to think about that, like what's it mean to own data? And so if I own data, what can I, how is it, how do I show that I own it, and what rights come with that? So that's just a really important point that they talked about in the video, was how do we actually conceptualize ownership, and what does that mean for how we correct some of these issues in the data economy. And they also mentioned the Data Freedom Act. So a Freedom Act kind of expounds on the fact that you can protect data with IP law. And so with the Data Freedom Act, it's more of a way of trying to create like a licensing regime, and possibly fall under trade secrets, but to also talk about informed consent and how people can consent to sharing their data, so consent management. So that's something to also think about too, at least I came up with that freedom access. How do you exercise the rights that you have in data, and what are those rights? So really, interesting one right there. Okay, moving on to the next point, like why a data cooperative and not an information fiduciary under a hypothetically amended Section 230. Yeah, so this was a really good discussion that they had about why information fiduciary might not be what you really need, because as Pam mentioned, just kind of pushing a little bit the information fiduciary. But one of the reasons why that might not necessarily be very effective is that, with the information fiduciary under Section 230, that really only applies to user-generated content. So, in the case of, let's say it's not the data is in, user-generated content, the UGC, how then do you actually govern that data? What's the organization for that? So that's, a discussion that came up, which was actually really good. But the thing is that you would still have that fiduciary duty because the members are owners of the cooperative, so they would have, the board would have a fiduciary duty to the members to act in their best interests. And the additional thing would be that, it's not limited to just Section 230, which deals with user-generated content. Generally, you see this a lot more on social networking sites. So, for example, Twitter, that would be user-generated content. But let's say, and this example we'll go into a little bit later, and as we move along this slide, is for example, like genomic data with like 23andMe. Like genomic data is not user-generated content. So how would an information fiduciary under hypothetically amended Section 230 actually deal with this type of data? Like it just wouldn't work. So that's where data cooperative can be more flexible on regarding the types of data it can actually steward. And then who audits the data cooperative? That's also a really good part. Ideally, it would be the members, but it's really important thing to think about is like who actually audits the data cooperative. And Sandy, that's an acting for Alex Penland, was talking about this. It generally works the same way you would for most financial organizations. It's like you can hire an auditing firm to audit the books. You could you could hire an audit firm to examine your data practices and how you're governing data. So there's a means to actually audit the data cooperative and its data governance processes. But ideally, the members would determine how the data cooperative should be audited. But that's a really important question. Is that even though data cooperative can be a steward and manage the data, you still have to understand how the data cooperative is doing that and have an audit, so that this way members know how things are working. So that you don't have a data cooperative really trying to commercialize the data from members without following the proper procedures. And another really important issue, something that Divya also mentioned, was that all needs support from a policy and technical side. We need legislation that can enhance the development and use of data cooperatives and really kind of put them at center stage. And this really having the technical infrastructure for the storage and sharing of data. So that's really important. Sandy really talked a lot more about the technical side in the paper, but also here in the post presentation about how do you develop the technical side to support a data cooperative. So that's those are two areas which really do need to be worked on to make data cooperatives a more appealing form of data stewardship. Okay, moving on to the benefits. So the biggest benefits that's that are really going for, of course, is power distribution from big firms to smaller firms and individuals. Really, some of the big benefits you can get from a data cooperative is one, you can avoid antitrust concerns. So for big tech, less data they control, the less less they have to worry about the Federal Trade Commission (FTC) possibly filing antitrust actions against them, because now they'll have less control, necessarily in the data economy. Benefits of data generators. This could be monetarily by providing them with some dividends, or some other monetary benefit, and additionally providing data generators with insights, and then also governance rights over the data cooperative, so you can determine how your data gets how it gets shared and used with third parties. So some benefits there. And also this one that Sandy mentioned, and really focusing more on the on credit unions, is can we create a network of co-ops with large data stores of member data? Because if you can do that, then it makes it a lot easier to bargain with big tech and other big firms, because it lowers the switching costs. Because if all the data is stored with the data cooperative, the data cooperative doesn't like the company's practices, they can just say that they're going to switch, and then that can guess their switch moving from one those services provided to another. And since you have a large amount of members involved and member data, then that puts the onus now on the big tech firms to change their practices, because now you guys have more bargaining power. And then, because it's also easier now for everyone to, easier for individuals to switch from one technology provider to another. Okay, now moving on to data commodification versus open data. This is something that Pam really harped on, and I thought was actually really important. Is that when we say we want data corp, it's the goal to commodify data, it's to make data open. I think it's really depends on the goal of that data cooperative. Could be it could be to commodify, could be to have it open, or could be both, or even something else. But this is a really important discussion, and Divya had a really good response. Was the goal wasn't for data, it's not necessarily to commodify data. It's not necessarily all data should be commodified. But the fact is that there is some data that can be commodified, and it's already being commodified. That's where the data cover comes in, is to address the commodification of that type of data. So the goal is not to commodify all data, but is to address the concerns that can arise with data commodification. So that's where data cover really come in. It's really to help address those concerns with data commodification. Yeah, and then Pam mentioned also the need really for open data, because that helps support innovation. And that's something that that cover could also help out with as well. And that's something that Divya and Sunny really were supportive of as well, as is open data. But their main focus is really more on how to address the issues and the harms that can arise with the commodification of data. And then there's also the 23andMe example. And so with 23andMe, pretty much acting as a data broker. So people buy these testing kits, and then 23andMe helps them get their genomic information. And then 23andMe, once that provides that genomic information to the purchaser of one of their kits, they keep it, and then they can also they choose who and decide who they share that genomic data with. It could be with other businesses, so they can sell that data, or they can share it with researchers. But of course, the main issue here really comes with the fact that 23andMe is commodifying people's genomic data, and generally when people are buying these test kits, do they necessarily expect that their data will be commodified and sold? Because they might have necessarily signed up to a 23andMe, been okay with them to sequence their genomic data, specifically to return it to them, but are they necessarily okay with them commodifying their genomic data and then selling that to third parties? 23andMe kind of gives a really, really good example of that, of this issue of user control over how their data gets shared, but also regarding commodification versus open data, because 23andMe can make that genomic data available to researchers so they can use that for healthcare related research, which can be a very good thing. So then they can also provide to companies, and they could, for example, like an insurance company, and they could look at people's genomic data, and they might use that to raise insurance premiums on certain individuals, and so that could be that is harmful to individuals, or it could be sold to government agencies, and then those government agencies could use that to that could be used to harm certain populations. So it really kind of really provides a really good example of this issue of between commodifying and having data be open, but also really the one-time consent regime and just consent management really cannot be one time with data, because it can be used and reused in multiple different ways. So 23andMe is just a really good company to discuss these issues. And so just be a little bit more just like this. I got so my notes up. As mentioned in the video, really the issue really comes up. As I was saying, you can share 23andMe shares some of this genetic data for research. So the example provided in the video said something gets shared with Stanford for research, which can be a really good thing. But then it can also, as I said, be sold to insurance providers who could use that data to raise people's premiums. I'm pretty sure people don't want that. And it's also mentioned that some of this data gets sold to like Procter and Gamble, and then of course you have to wonder, it's like well, why are you selling to Procter and Gamble, and what are they going to do with that? And then how does that impact me, the data supplier? And I'll just kind of try and remember my words here. And really, this just really exemplifies the conundrum of a self-dealing data intermediary, especially when they're making money off the data that they're supposed to steward. Because they, of course, if they're trying to generate revenue from it, and they just sell it to anyone, of course, so I was saying so that if they sell this to anyone, of course, it could have negative implications for that supplier. Could be positive, could be negative, but things you really don't know. And for once again, going back to that consent procedure, it's it's a really one-time thing, and it's not very granular. Especially when it comes to something like 23andMe. Okay, I take this test kit, got the genomic data. It's really a share or not share, instead of having it be more contextual. Because without having that context, it becomes really hard to know why people are sharing, and also who they want to share that with, and in which ways do they want to share that. And then Debbie had a really good response here. So in Debbie's example, she's like, well, I'll share my genomic data with 23andMe, but her brother doesn't. 23andMe will still get information about Divya's brother, because of course they have similar genomic data. So it's not necessarily just about the the data suppliers who provide their data to 23andMe. It's also the people who can be affected who did not supply their data. Because if I provide my genomic data, of course you can always group me with other people who have similar genomic data, and then you can use that to predict on people with other similarities, and they don't necessarily need to be people who provide this provide data to 23andMe. 23andMe can predict on people who were not directly supplying data to so 23andMe can predict on people who weren't necessarily even included in their data set. So that's something to also really keep in mind with this conundrum, because the data itself once again is in the aggregate, but doesn't necessarily just affect the people involved in the direct relationship between 23andMe, who's collecting the data, and the people paying for these kits, who are the data suppliers. It's also people even outside of that relationship between the supplier and the collector. And so that's pretty much it for for this slide. And hopefully you guys really enjoyed this video. I thought was actually like very good. Okay, so moving on to the really big paper. A Relational Theory of Data Governance by Salome Viajan. Yeah, I'm pretty sure I butchered her name, and I completely apologize. I'm just not going to use anyone's name anymore because I'm probably just going to butcher it. But I know this paper is really long, but it's definitely worth the read because it really gives such a great understanding of some of the core issues we have in the data economy, and especially regarding our data governance legal regime, and really expounds on some of the topics discussed in Divya's presentation, and some of the concerns that Alex Palin also had in his paper on personal, on personal data cooperatives, and even on some of the issues with HDCs. I feel this paper just really kind of discusses the issue so well, and also about how our views of data influences how we try to resolve these issues in the data economy, and how sometimes certain conceptualizations could necessarily lead to somewhat suboptimal solutions. All right, so let's get into this. Get into the paper. So we'll just start. At the introduction, I'm just going to be going. Just writing very brief notes on some of the sections. So the paper is kind of unfortunately long, but it's a great read. So first, what's the application? Transformation of information about people into a commodity. So this can include on and offline activity. And so what's data governance law? The legal regime that governs how data about people is collected, processed, and used. All right, and what's our current setting right now? So that's our data governance legal regime is failing to protect technology users from the harms of data extraction. So that's pretty much our current setting, core setting. Pretty much everyone will agree with that. That our current legal regime is not helping protect technology users. And here's Salome's core arguments. Big tech collects data to drive population level insights regarding how data subjects relate to others, and applies these insights to all individuals sharing these population features. Status quo takes on an individualist approach, which misses population level harms. The relevant task of data governance is to find collective institutional forms for responsible data governance. Then we went to the core problems. The sociality problem, the inability for the current data governance legal regime to address harms arising from horizontal relations. The legitimacy problem, how can data governance law distinguish legitimate from illegitimate data use without relying on individual adjudication. Okay, so moving on to the next section, data governance status and status quo. So I'm just going to be going section by section, because there are some points to mention in each one. So first point, the key competitive advantage is access to high quality data. So the more access you have to high quality data, the better an organization can perform. So this is one of the reasons why there's such a hunt for data. Because the more, well, not necessarily the more you have, but the higher the quality, the bigger competitive advantage you'll actually have, because you use that for multiple things. Because higher quality, you can build better AI machine learning systems, get better insights into your customers, and find better ways to price goods, services, or bids. So there is an actual key competitive advantage to having high quality data. And I think that's a really important point to hone in on, because when we talk about data, there's a data economy. Companies want data, but it's like, why exactly is there such an emphasis on data? And that's the reason why it does provide that advantage. So of course, since it provides that advantage, companies are going to want to have it, and so that's where a lot of the the drive comes from. And then moving on to how does data produce revenue? Produce revenue in three ways. You can sell directly. You can use it to improve your services, or you can use it to predict, change, or modify behavior. And behavior use is really the largest source of revenue for most tech companies, and generally this you can see is more in the advertising tech industry. That's find better ways to send people ads. I'm pretty sure I don't think I've ever clicked on an ad, but it's one of those. It's really the biggest ways. How do you uh, uh, modify people's behavior? And if you can do that, then that's actually like a lot of value in of itself. So those are the three ways that Salome highlights regarding how data can actually produce value. Granted, those behavioral insights comes from the ad tech industry, but it gets used in other industries as well. It can also be used for identifying like potential voters. What activities are associated with risky or risk averse types of behaviors. So like definitely for risk rating or insurance. So behavioral patterns are pretty much important like in any industry. So it's also just highlights the multifaceted uses of data and the reason why it's so important to have. And it can also drive decisions. I know Salome mentions in the paper HBO Max negotiations with Amazon Roku over access and use of user data. That was really important talking point for them, because in data user data they can figure out more ways to produce revenue. So it's becoming a much more important thing in mergers and acquisitions, and also in deals between big tech firms. And I know it's not necessarily mentioned in the paper, but I know I think in MGM's big, I'm not sure if it's an acquisition or a merger, but it was an M&A type of activity. Like the data was about, I think, 30 to 50% of the value of the company. User data. And so, as you can see, companies consider it to be valuable. They can produce revenue from it, and it's becoming extremely valuable to these big tech companies. So, the actual value of data was pretty large. Whether people know it or not, it's something that does drive companies. All right, then moving on to the Fair Information Practice Principles, FIPS. So let's notice and consent notice and consent privacy regime focus on individualist approach. So notice and consent, pretty much that's companies have to send you a notice that they are gonna collect your data, might process your data, and then also consent. You have to consent to it, but of course, notice and consent can be very RE, as been mentioned in this lecture and previous lectures. Really, that's one type of consent procedure is pretty unhelpful. And of course, what are you actually consenting to? I don't think necessarily everyone knows what they're consenting to. Don't expect most people to read the terms. Why would they read the terms? This really long. But the regime itself, it's not necessarily very helpful in a data context. But that's pretty much where it comes from. And as I mentioned, has that individualist approach, and really it's about trying to grant individuals more control over their data. But of course, as I mentioned, a bit earlier, it makes it really hard. It's a really hard thing to do in practice. But because FIPS kind of influences a lot of privacy laws, it's generally how you would, a lot of privacy laws tend to take on that type of approach of notice and consent. So, and since this individuals also puts the onus on the individual to exercise their rights, rather than necessarily companies just respecting certain uses, it's up to the individual to determine the use, and that can be extremely difficult. Extremely difficult thing to do. Okay, and then there were two this is regarding critiques of privacy law. Really one of the access control, which is really trying to stop people from just accessing data all willy nilly and providing individuals more control over how their data gets accessed and used. And then the social value of privacy. That's just the fact that there's a social value of privacy, not just beyond just the individual. And as mentioned in the paper, really sets really does allow for more of a, or at least helps facilitates democratic political flourishing. And really by having that privacy, allows people to really have the protection of the freedom of association, freedom of speech, and really it's hard for one individual to actually really exercise their privacy. So seeing from a social side, it's also something to keep in mind. And actually, going back to the individual, really it's that having privacy is pretty much a condition, or should be instrumental, right? For just society, and really it's kind of one of the basic things you should have for an individual to actually participate in society is to have privacy. And so that's at least on the control side, it's something to think about. And then on the access side, is that if you you should have more control over how information about you gets accessed, because if you do that, you'll increase an individual's agency. Or on the other hand, if people have less control over who has access to that, now they have less ability to exercise agency in their lives. Okay, and moving on to the next section, data relations and their social effects. I thought this section was really a really fun read. Really showing the view, which I don't think gets talked about enough, is just the relational side. And so that's what this section really kind of dives into. So of course we start with the sociality problem, which I described in the previous slide. And Sloan provides a hypothetical. Tattoo View obtains Adam's tattoo after acquiring Tattoo ID's dataset from a social network of users who have tattoos. I want to focus on this hypothetical because I feel that this one's probably going to be a little bit more realistic for at least most individuals, especially since we're focused more on the data economy. The other hypothetical mentioned was the sharing with the FBI, but in this one, so I think this is probably a little bit more realistic for most people. It's really just having the acquisition of data sets by another company. I feel that this a little bit more, at least more realistic and more jarring. At least in this, hypothetical, and hopefully you read the paper, but I'm not going to go over the whole hypothetical. This one's just talking about, Adam, who's a former gang member, voluntarily shared his tattoo on, his tattoo image on Tattoo ID. Okay, and so, Tattoo View wants to develop an AI system that can recognize tattoos. And so this assets come from Tattoo ID. And so since it's on Tattoo ID, in this scenario, Adam voluntarily shared his image. So, there's not really a problem here regarding, any, malfeasance on how the data got collected. So, that's not a concern. The data pipeline itself was pretty clean. There's, at least from how the data got collected, there's really not a, technically a ethical concern because Adam willingly put it on there. And so that's why I also wanted to talk about this hypothetical because because of how the data is collected here, it's not really an issue. And this harkens back to the first lecture with the issue with Jillian York and her face image data. Her face image ended up in a face image data set. In both instances, both of them voluntarily chose to put up their image, but of course they probably didn't expect their image to ever be used in this way. So that's why I included this hypothetical. And so this only really breaks down why the individualist conception for that doesn't why it fails here in this scenario, because it talks about how the data could harm Adam, but doesn't really capture the way that the data flow could affect Ben though. Most importantly, Adam wasn't coerced into sharing data; he willingly gave it up, and probably aligns with Adam's intent, which was to have people see his tattoo image. So at least from Adam's point of view, like there's no issue here for Adam. Because he wanted to share it, he shared it, so no issue there. But the issue is really the fact that this still affects Ben. So really trying to harp on the horizontal relation. The relationship between Adam, the data supplier, and tattoo ID, the data collector. That vertical relationship is not necessarily problematic, because Adam willingly shared, but it's the horizontal relationship between Adam and Ben that can be problematic, because Ben can face consequences from them creating this algorithm to recognize tattoos. And so, at least for Ben's interests, since Ben probably doesn't have a legal interest here, he's actually kind of screwed. So his interests are not represented in the data governance legal regime, even though he could actually be harmed because of this the data Adam shared. Okay, so moving on to the vertical and horizontal relations. So the vertical axis, this is the data relation between individual data subject and individual data collector, also known as data processor. So individual data subject, I've also been saying this is data supplier, but that's just a subject, this person who the data is about. It might not necessarily be a supplier, because a supplier is someone who's usually willingly given you data. They might not necessarily be that, but they are someone who's the data is about, so they're the data subject. Okay, and so moving on to the horizontal axis, that's how data production relates to data subjects, not to data collectors, but to one another and to others that share relevant population features with the data subject. So as I mentioned up top with the hypothetical, if you read it, that relationship between Adam and Ben, that's the concern. There's much more of the horizontal relation rather than the vertical relation between Adam and tattoo ID. It's really the horizontal relation between Adam and Ben. So horizontal data relations are central to how data production produces both social value and social risks. That's a really important part here. So the aggregate effects of data amplify the consequences of not focusing on horizontal relations. So really the big issue here is how's value produced from that is created from this horizontal relation, finding this population level insights. And so if you can find those insights, that's where the value really comes from. But the current governance law legal regime only takes into account that vertical relationship. So it's missing that horizontal relationship, and that's really where a lot of these issues in the data economy really come from. It's really from the horizontal, not from the vertical. And so, look at the second point, why, the application comes from, determining group categories and then using individuals that to predict on others. So once you have those group categories, I have this individual that I can predict on other people. And so that's something I mentioned with the 23andMe issue. So that, and once you have all this genomic data and this one that Divya really pointed out in her presentation, well, actually in post presentation as a response, was the fact that she gives her data to 23andMe. Now 23andMe can predict on Divya's brother because they have similar genomic data. So the issue isn't just solely the person who provides the data to the data collector. That vertical relationship is also the ones in the horizontal relation. And then when it's the last point, the prevalence of horizontals in data thus creates a structural mismatch for correlations between data subjects and data collectors. So that structural mismatch really comes from the fact that if you collect that, the collector's trying to exert, predict on that horizontal relation, not necessarily that vertical relation. And so, really, that mismatch comes from that because they're trying to create value from the horizontal. So between that vertical relation, doesn't necessarily take into account that horizontal relation, and also means that the vertical relationship gets as I was saying, mismatched because of differing interests. I'm moving to the next point. Without accounting for horizontal relations in data governance law, the interests they represent and the behaviors they motivate from data collectors can be fully accounted. So that's really the big point. That's the only really want to point out, is that these horizontal relations are extremely important to the actual value generated from data. But if they're not taken account into the data governance legal regime, we miss out on the social benefits or benefits that come from horizontal relations, but also the harms that come from them. And this really mentioned in the paper as social informational harms. Okay, and then as I mentioned, there are some practical implications, and this is specifically in subsection D. So I recommend focusing really on subsection D. And so one of the practical implications I talked about a little bit earlier is really missing the importance of these relations in the actual data economy. So that's the big one, and also recognizing certain kinds of injustices. So doesn't take account those social injustices which occur at the horizontal layer, and also missing on those social beneficial forms of data production. So really good section to read. So there's this example Solly provides, which is this ice and Fintal example, which I think it's actually pretty good. And so ice, I can't remember the full name for them. I think it's Immigration and Customs Enforcement. But ICE, they purchased location data from Vental. Vental's database tracks location information from millions of mobile devices, and they get their data from mobile apps. So this could be games, weather apps. So once again, going back to the issue of apps connected to other apps, and so using SDK that could collect your location data and share with someone else. And this is something that was mentioned in lecture 1 in the location data marketplace article from the markup. So it comes up here again, and as you can see, the so how did ICE get this data? They pretty much got it from here, and so that's one part of the issue. Of course, is that those people who are sharing their data might not have expected to ever end up in the hands of ICE. And another really big issue is that even though this data is collected from a large population, only a small percentage of that population faces extremely harsh consequences, which here would be migrants crossing the border. Really impacting on the population level insights is trying to find that particular population here, which would be migrants, and trying to from that data causing a harm to them. So it's not necessarily that everyone who's in the database is necessarily harmed, but certain groups within that population can be harmed, and that's really the social side coming about. So I thought that's just a good example. And so Salome also talks about how the data flow works, and I think that's something I'll just talk about uh, probably in the quote. Ventil's data flow and X horizontal data relations, whereby a relevant shared feature, in other words, movement patterns, is operationalized to make a prediction on documented immigrants and acts back on a group member according to this categorization, detaining them. This amplifies the stakes of the data flow as well as the shared feature acts upon on the basis of membership in a socially oppressed group. So that quote, pretty much in of itself is a pretty good example of how the data is flowing, how that horizontal relation is established, and how it can be used to harm just a small percentage of that overall population. And so so once you have the feature movement patterns, like, all right, let's try to predict someone undocumented immigrants. So those people sharing their movement patterns, they're probably pretty unaware that it's being used for this type of purpose. And once again, that's a common issue that's come up throughout the lectures in this course. It's just the unintended consequences of data sharing. And something that also came up with Jillian York's articles while we're on the face image data set. So it's a similar issue also brought up here. So hopefully this kind of helps hone in on this particular issue. And one thing someone really points out, which I think is a really good point here, is that movement patterns by themselves are not oppressive, but can constitute an oppressive process based on social relations. And that's really the big point here, is that just the database itself isn't harmful, but it can be used for harm, and that's really the big issue. And the horizontal relation that gives materialized here is a social process of oppression. And so if you're not part of this oppressed group or the relevant group, which is undocumented immigrant, you really have negligible risk of that type of social informational harm affecting you, even if your location data gets collected. And that's the other point too. It's like, at least for the majority of people in that data set, they're probably never, even if ICE has their movement patterns, it's really probably not going to be an issue for them in their life. But for a certain group of them, it will be harmful. And the fact that you can collect all that data, and once you have enough data, you can start making predictions, start training, AI systems, ML systems. That training can then be used to go, harm certain groups. And since it's in the aggregate now, of course it becomes valuable. But then it's like, now we can use it to predict, and that's really something I think Salome really does very well. In this paper is that where this injustice comes from is how the data actually flows. It's not and how it's collected. That's really where the harm is coming from here. Is how it's how the data flows, not necessarily in the collection. Because sure, you can clean up the collection, but if people have incentive to share their movement patterns, you could still end up in the same issue, because once again, the fact that the database is here and how it can be used can still lead to the suppression, even if you necessarily gave individuals more control over their the regarding movement patterns. They still chose to share it, and with some third party, and then that third party chooses to share with ICE. It's like, this could still happen. And that's something that Salome really gets on. And so that's you could have socially advantaged groups who engage in voluntary data collection that benefits them, while harming socially disadvantaged groups. And that's really kind of the a really big issue of concern, is that just even the voluntary sharing of collection of that can lead to harming certain groups, and it's pretty much unintentional. It's, most people aren't necessarily sharing their data for these type of things to happen. And so, and then there's also the Beatrice and Kara hypothetical, which is pretty good. Uh, I think it's a really good example because with Beatrice and Kara, their third parts Alice's transaction with Ring. So they both bear externalities from Alice's relationship with Ring due to her unrepresented interest in this data flow. And so they both could benefit from having their portals under Alice's surveillance, but then they also incur some risk, which is that shared population data flows from Alice's Ring to the neighbor app, Amazon, local law enforcement. So it's a really good example of someone engaging in voluntary data collection, or some people could even call it luxury surveillance. And it's like, well, I just want to protect my my property. But then again, now that this data gets picked up and the people who get recorded in the Ring video, they could also potentially face harm, even though this person, Alice, probably just like she just wants to protect her place, but the use of the data could be used to harm someone else. Yeah, so it's a really interesting one. So it's something to also keep in mind. Okay, so moving on to the next slide. Dim reforms and their conceptual limits. So you have two primary types of reforms: proprietarian reforms and dignitarian. So in the proprietarian view, you see data as a property right or considered as a production entitled to a wage. So either it's purely property that I own, or it's recognition of some type of labor. This view is mostly about trying to get some economic return for data. And there are some benefits and issues. So primary benefit is just really the recognition of that data is valuable and that the generation of data should be considered valuable. So that's one of the major benefits there. And so regarding the issues, it's only eloquently pointed out, the issue is really not necessarily conceptualizing data as capital, but really has the legal rights to benefit from that capital. So, at least from Sony's point of view, the issue is really that we're not rejecting the concept of data as an asset. And so, really, the governance of that then becomes one of property relations or wage relations. So this could be through contract law, property law, employment law, or even labor law. And then so regarding some of the benefits, as I mentioned, you can get compensation. One of the proposed ones is also a market efficiency claim, which means that data subjects will have better ability to bargain with data collectors, and hopefully this can make data markets more efficient. So hopefully this will reduce the levels of data extraction relative to the allocation of benefits. And also, DARPA as well as allocating some legal entitlements over data to data subjects. So I mean, there actually are some benefits to this type of view. And then regarding some of the problems of competition and fairness, how this view looks at it, regarding competition, the response is really data portability. It's have technical interoperability requirements, legal rights that allow users to transfer their data. And then fairness, regarding fairness, the response is remuneration. Parents people should get rewarded for playing a role in the creation of a materially valuable resource, which is the data set. And so generally this is response that comes about regarding the wealth concentration by big tech companies. And so even then at least a little skeptical, and I think she provides some good critiques regarding this response. I feel that this is probably like the most popular response, at least here in the U.S., as really to see data as an asset. And so some of the reasons why Salami is skeptical is one, is this even practical? The practicality is actually probably well, it's probably very impractical because it's a lot of complex and comprehensive micropayments. And when would that be? How would that be feasible? And how would that even be cost effective? And then, how would that actually, materially address the issues of data extraction? This could actually just lead to a kind of a race to the bottom, as Divya Siddharth mentioned in her video, which is presenting on data cooperatives. This might not necessarily reduce extraction. It could actually, lead to more extraction, or at least incentivize more sharing, but not necessarily within the best interests of the actual data subject. So that was a really important, concerns regarding really her critique of these type of proposals. And I thought it's just a good way of kind of addressing it. But it's you do see data ownership come up a lot. It's like, oh, people should own their data, people should own their data, people should own their data. Of course, what does that actually mean? What does it mean to actually own data? And if you see data as property, like how do you actually manage that property? How do you get to return in that property? So, something that's something to keep in mind. And another thing, which I thought Salami did a really good job of talking about, is that doesn't necessarily like erase privacy risks. Because once again, people will now be incentivized to share their data, but then it doesn't change the misuses of that data. There's doesn't incentivize companies from using data in ways that can harm individuals. Actually, it just means you gotta pay them before you do. And so since it's puts more pressure on people to sell data, you could say this actually makes privacy a privilege or a luxury, because for people who are low income, selling their data, so it's a way for them to make money. So for them, you're kind of pushing them to sacrifice their own privacy so that they can earn an income. So this in of itself could actually make people actually have less privacy rather than necessarily having more privacy. So it's just it's an interesting look at it, because I would say this once again it's the most popular, I would say, proposal for dealing with some of the issues in the data economy, and really just like the reasons why you should be somewhat skeptical of them. I think Sully has some really valid points there, and some things to really think about. So now moving on to the dignitarian proposals. So dignitarian data conceives of data as an expression or extension of individualist selfhood. So here data is more person-like. It's really an extension of the really the individual. So that's a dignitarian. And then the critique. So really covers the reasons why the application, the extraction, and algorithmic governmentality are pretty much why they're wrong. This is mentioned in the paper, so I'll just kind of go over it very, very briefly. So critique, that's dignitarian provides with application. It's really creating like a digital twin for people, and so this digital twin pretty much acts autonomously from the actual individual. So it's not a one for one. It's a digital twin. So like just your digital identity is not your real identity or your actions. So the digital version of you might be X, Y, and Z, but that might not be completely who you are in real life. So that's one issue there. That gets brought up, and additionally, it's commodifying that digital version of you, and could potentially lead to alienation of the inner self. So who's the real you? Is it the one that's digital, or is it the you that's in the real world? So regarding ultimate governmentality, this is kind of more like a surveillance thing. So using algorithms to change how this the actual data subject understands themselves. Uh, and so the critique here is really that this can undermine the capacity for a person to for them to uh, form their own self and enact their own self will. So some have a harm with their own agency, but also to create their own identities. Because the algorithm itself, pretty much puts you in a certain categories, certain classifications. And so, are you the classification? Are you, how can you form yourself if the algorithm is just telling you who you are? So that's, really important parts about data science that also wants to address that. And so, this really comes from Susan Subah's point of view regarding surveillance capitalism. So that's also removes our private lives because it pretty much turns that commodifies that. So it destroys our personal agency and also kind of removes any sense of a private life or inner life. And so and just in summary, it's really because all three of these acts that come from the that are wrong because they manipulate people and they violate the sanctity of their inner being and undermine their capacity to express and enact their free will. These are pretty much fundamental threats to personhood, and therefore just wrong. Regardless of how the data actually gets used, whether it could be beneficial or harmful, it doesn't matter. It's the very fact that it's a threat to personhood. Its reasonable identification is wrong here. And so the legal response is really to advocate for person-like rights. So it's more quasi-personhood rather than quasi-ownership, as you would get with the proprietarian proposals. But the unfortunate issue is that since it takes such an individualist approach, it also misses out on some of these the horizontal relations and concerns. So sure, it gets an individual some control, but doesn't take into account those social informational harms and the benefits that could arise from data sharing. Okay, moving on to the next points. Both dictatorial proprietarian fail to handle social harms, and that's really the big points that Salome really wants to point out with these proposals to reform the data economies. That's both of them, miss out on the horizontal side, which is really the big catalyst for the collection, processing, and use of data. So there are 4 sections mentioned here. The absence of horizontal relations, series of harm, just data production, the reforms to socially beneficial data production. Yeah, and so I'll probably just skip this one because it's kind of a short read, but it's pretty important just to see kind of where these proposals kind of fall under. Pretty much we just understand the proposals and the fact that they miss on some of the social harms. That kind of covers pretty much all the information you kind of need to know. But just finding the social harms that just kind of further describes the reasons why the proprietarian and the dignitarian proposals, the reasons why they necessarily fail to address the core issues in the data economy. And then we get to data as a democratic medium. And this is definitely more suited to a data cooperative since cooperative itself is the goal of making a democratic organization. So this one is very much focused on, well, at least very helpful in thinking about the development and growth and use of data cooperatives. So first and foremost, we have the legitimacy problem. So of course, this describes the legitimacy problem in the first slide, but this is a problem. Once again, is, how can data governance law distinguish legitimate from illegitimate data use without relying on individual adjudication? and that's in itself is extremely hard. And then Salome provides a very, very good example at the with Water Corp versus the Water Org hypothetical. Yeah, and so in this hypothetical, you have Water Corp, which collects data on household water consumption. Similarly, as well for Water Org, but with Water Corp, this private organization, while with Water Org, this public municipality, municipal public agency. Yeah, and so both are collecting data on household water consumption. Uh, of course, this is very personal information, and then this is generally used for help regarding water management, and so trying to figure out best strategies for for charging for water use, pricing. It can be used for a lot of things, and that's something that also gets mentioned in the paper. But really, the issue really is that we take an individualist approach. It doesn't really help us understand how to address the concerns from these two different types of organizations collecting this data, because they're both collecting the same data, but how we actually interact with them is really very different. Because Water Org, it's a public organization, so there's this allows for more democratic representation and determination of societal goals. So there's more participation, and there's also constitutional constraints, legal constraints regarding how the data can be used. But for Water Corp, there's no means for democratic decision making, and there's no government oversight at all. So they both need this data to do the same thing, but both of them give you different structures for actually governing them and determining the goals for the organization. And so, as Salome mentions, if you just focus on the premises or rights of each individual or household, whether to participate in collection, this doesn't really capture the distinct purposes and conditions of the data production that comes from Water Org or Water Corp, and also doesn't take into account the overlapping interests of all these households. And so, in that hypothetical, just really talking about the fact that you can have different organizations all needing the same type of data, and since they all even though they all need the same type of data, the way they govern and the way you should address them can be completely different. So it's just a really important thing to keep in mind is that the users of data can be completely different from each other. They don't necessarily need to be one for one. And so as Salome really mentions, really the only way you can address the distinction between Water Corp and Water Org, and really to provide legitimacy over how they actually collect and process data, can really only be done at population level. Ideally through democratic means. It's not something you can really do, at the individual level, because it's just way too difficult, and try to get each individual has to understand really how the data is going to be collected and used, and then additionally, taking into account that horizontal relation. That's really the big thing. It's like how each individual house is not going to be concerned necessarily about the horizontal relation or how other households use water. It's probably just not going to happen. And so here we have this quote, because data subjects' interests do not reduce down to how their individual water consumption data is extracted or used, and because there are multiple interests at stake beyond that the individual data subjects, it's impossible to determine the legitimacy of Water Org's data production simply by referring to the conditions of data subjects' interpersonal exchanges with Water Org. And that's really the most important part, is that just from each individual, you really can't determine whether the use is legitimate or not. Because one individual might say it's legitimate, another one might say it's not, and once again, you can predict on groups of people who are necessarily the data suppliers, so they're also included as well. So even if you don't consent to it and you think it's wrong, you still could face the consequences, that's not something you can really deal with at an individual level. And then as the hypothetical continues, it also mentions the citizen named Kate and how her interests and how the household water data can't be reduced to just an individual interest, because her concerns were adverse uses of such data. But even if her data is not collected, it can still of course you can still predict based on other similarly situated households. So that's something to also keep in mind, and I think it's just really good things that was included in the examples, that really for her interest to really be really to be taken account for, it can only be done at a population level, can't really be done at an individual level. And so even if you did have like a proprietarian regime, like it really wouldn't work because of for that reason. And so trying to have things just fall back down to the individual doesn't really help. And another thing that's I thought was a really good point in the paper was also mentioned the data collector's interests. Because it's not just data subjects; it's also data collectors. They're both involved in the use the use of data. So I really liked how Salome really mentioned that here in this hypothetical, as for water.org, because with water.org needs high quality household water data to be able to do its job. And so water.org can't properly develop water management strategies unless it has this data. And so the actual harm from arising from this isn't just on one individual household. It's going to be on the whole community, because if water.org can't properly manage the water, that harms everyone in that community. And so for water.org, that's this interest really comes at the population level. It's not necessarily for an individual household. This one household is like they probably don't care, but also their water might be fine, but for a couple other households it might be really bad. And so this interest in trying to properly manage household water can't really be addressed at the individual level. It can really only be addressed at the population level, because you do need everyone's data to really plan. So not just for the data subject to express their interests, it has to be at the population level, but also for the data collector. Some of these interests are also at the population level. So it goes for not just the data subject, but the data collector, and really just showing the fact that population level interests really do need to be taken into account in our discussions on the value of data, but on how data should be stewarded. Okay, and then moving on to shifting from individual rights to collective ordering, or alternatively, shift from individual medium to a democratic medium. So I thought this quote was really, really good. So this reorientation raises core questions of democratic governance: how to grant people a say in the social processes of their own formation, how to balance fair recognition with special concern for certain minority interests, how to identify the relevant public or institutional level of civic life at which to coalesce and govern such collective interests, and how to not only recognize that data production produces winners and losers, but also develop fair institutional responses to these effects. It's such a great quote about really what happens when you transition from just looking at from an individualist perspective to a collective perspective, and especially as a democratic medium, looking at data in that way. This then means that you can actually address these questions, because now you're at the population level. So lots of things can now actually be addressed. And as I was saying, this does raise political questions and questions of democratic governance. Just once you switch to this collective ordering, now you have these questions come up, and as I just stated, stay in the quote that's in the point above. You have all these questions which come up, but it's good to have these questions come up, because these are actually important questions which do need to be addressed. And so, once you can actually have them up, now we can actually address this. And so once we go to collective ordering, we can try to figure out how do we balance overlapping and at times competing interests at the population level, because not everyone necessarily has the same goal. And even the Water Oregon Water Corp hypothetical, you have someone like Kate who doesn't want adverse use, so she might not want her data shared, while someone else might want their data shared. And you have Water Oregon, it's like, well, hey, we need all your data so that we can properly manage this water system. And so turning this into a collective ordering, into a democratic medium, allows for those competing interests to actually be brought to the forefront and actually discuss and try to figure out some good solutions or compromises so that we can actually meet our tenant goals and try to address everyone's concerns. So that's really good parts about this. Just like now we can actually have these questions and have discourse on these questions. And so, something that's also, which I thought was really good, sets, since, we look at this democratic medium, then we can look at, democracy as it's a normative egalitarian standard. And, democracy, also provides a theory to explain unjust relations. Just, and a couple of the other examples, also our hypotheticals that we talk about, like the ICE example. It's like, oh, you have an unjust relationship regarding documented migrants that come from the movement pattern data set. Undocumented immigrants, they're unfortunately have faced social information harm, while other people in more of a social advantage group don't face that. So that's an unjust relation. It's like all of us have our data collected, but only certain people are harmed from that collection. And that's something that Marxist kind of provides us as a theory to explain unjust relations, but also like how do we somewhat think about addressing them. And so really one of the really good parts about here, which I really like, was just that mention. And so really the fact that there are democratic institutions, like the goals, it's not solely to have people once you have everyone really is equal, to provide conditions for individual freedom, but also provide institutional arrangements to have people have equal status, but also to address things. So providing those conditions. So you have individual, but also for institutional arrangements to address unjust relations. And since you can address unjust relations, now you have recognition that there are competing interests. And that's really kind of, I think, a really, really important part in this paper, and that's something really focuses on, and I really like that she did, because if you assume everything should be equal, and then you have something unequal, well, okay, well now we have to address that. And so that of course comes up with competing interests. My interest is this, yours is that. Whose interest takes hold here, or how do we find the middle ground between our interests? And that's when you can get with the Marxist assumes everyone's equal. So there's something unequal, we're supposed to address that. So that's something I really liked. That Salome really focus on, was talking about democracy as a egalitarian standard. So I thought that was a really good thing that Salome talked about, and that it gets even bolstered more concerning the population level interest in debt reduction. As we talked about earlier, just how horizontal relations are extremely important in the data economy. But the fact that we do have democracy as an egalitarian standard, it's really the part where I like, as well as really the fact that personal choices regarding data sharing also reflect how those choices affect others. So not just political and not just economic benefits for that particular individual, but also can there be benefits for other individuals, or could it be harms for other individuals? So not just the benefits and harms for the individual choosing to share their data, but also the benefits and harms for other people who might be in horizontal relation. And then this leads to the relevant task of data governance. And really the relevant task is to reassert individual control over the terms of one's own datafication. Even if it were possible. I should state that I'm really quoting the paper, but it's really to instead it's to develop institutional responses necessary to represent the relevant population level interests at stake in data production. So now the task of reforming the data governance legal regime is not about providing opportunities for exit, payment, or recourse. Now it's really about securing recognition and standing to shape the purposes and conditions of data production and establishing terms for legitimate mutual obligation. So how I should use data, how you should use data, and how do we handle our competing interests. And so I thought, and Sloan also made a really good point going back to the Water Org versus Water Corp hypo. Really, like, what is the issue here? For Water Corp, it's really not the fact that they collect data. It's really more of the fact that the households have no ability to, have any, say over the quality of their data relations they're being placed in. So, the social process of the data production, which they become subjected to, they have really no say over that. So that's, at least going back to the hypo, that's more the core issue. It's the fact that there's a lack of democratic governance or means for stakeholders to actually have an ability to meaningfully determine their data relations and how those data relations affect them. So yeah, that's Salome also mentioned in the hypo, which I thought was pretty good. And Salome makes a really good point about the difference between negative rights and affirmative rights. So in the Water Corp example, let's just stick with the proprietarian approach. Even though households might have they get negative rights of exit or payment, so you can opt out or you can get paid. It's not the same as having an affirmative right, which is the ability to be represented in the governance of Water Corp and having the ability to determine the conditions and purposes of that production. And so, instead of being very negative where you can leave, instead here it's like, well, it's not necessarily you can say, but it's like you get to, govern where you stay rather than be able to govern when you leave. Which is, very different approach. And this way you actually do have much more of a, a say in how Water Corp works. And additionally, you don't miss out on those horizontal relations either. Because if just one individual household leaves, they could still be subjected to the predictions that Water Corp makes based on other similarly situated households. So I just thought that was a really good point to mention. So that there's between negative rights and affirmative rights, and how having affirmative rights gives you more, greater ability to determine the conditions and benefits of data production rather than just having simply payments or opt-outs. Okay, and so moving on to the next slide. Okay, yeah, we're still on that's democratic medium. All right, so benefits of data as a democratic medium. Yeah, and so I know this lecture is pretty long, but I apologize, but there's just like a lot to talk about. Okay, so the benefits of place social informational harm on equal footing with individual informational harm. So datafication is not only unjust because data extraction or resulting data governmentality may violate individual autonomy. Datafication may also be unjust because it violates ideals of social equality. Social informational harm thus represents an additional and fundamental form of potential injustice of relevance for data governance law. So I thought that's a really important benefit that you get from viewing data as a democratic medium. So that now that's social informational harm and individual harm are on equal footing. You actually do pretty much need to somewhat address both of them, and this way you can actually consider both of them in the data governance legal regime. All right. theoretical basis from which to make the positive case for all forms of social data production. Yeah, that's another point as well, and something that comes up with in the Water Corp Water Org hypo. The thing is, there are means for socially beneficial data production, but if we only take an individualist approach, it's really tough to actually have that happen. And so some of the benefits we can get from that is that we can reduce information asymmetry between companies and consumers, and also data production for public interest. So we can, produce data to help solve public problems. So, those are, areas where we can, where social data production can be really extremely helpful. Coming up with like the example that came from the HTC article talking about health data cooperatives. It's really talking about one of the benefits is that you can have more healthcare related research which can come out and benefit patients. So it could benefit those members in the health data cooperative, but also could benefit people outside the health data cooperative, because now we have this research and if they're similarly have similar features, similar medical histories, the results from a study could also benefit them too. So it's not just necessarily those, just one group of people, could also extend beyond them. So going to data production of public interest, there's a lot of ways that could be used for, for public interest that goes just beyond the data subjects. And moving to the next point, democratic regimes are not concerned with data as property-like or person-like, rather more focused on social relations. So it's really hinting on those, harping on those horizontal relations. So, really repudiates the idea we can reduce social interests we have in data value production and its distribution to individual proprietarian interests and social data resources. Also repudiates that we can reduce legal protection of dignitary interest in information to the vertical relation between data subjects and data collector. In other words, not including horizontal relations. And so regarding, repudiating some of the proprietarian reforms, I think I talk about them a little bit more in the previous slide. And then moving on to the last point, democratic evidence to help understand plurality of population level interests and competing interests. That's really one of the biggest points is, just providing a place for population level interests to be discussed and to address competing interests. And if you look at the Water Corp versus the Water Org hypo, that really helps you understand that point even more. So yeah, moving on to the next slide. Oh, actually no, that's the last slide. Okay, my bad there. So I'd like to say thank you for staying with me for all this long. Yeah, I'm sorry that this is like 2 hours. I really don't mean to make it this long, but this paper is really important to understand the issues in the data economy and the reasons why democratic mediums can provide certain benefits that you might not get from purely perceiving reforms in data coming from a proprietarian viewpoint or from a dignitarian viewpoint. So once again, I'm Charles Jovu. I'm the instructor for the Introduction to Data Cooperatives course. You can find that on the Ledgerback Academy website. The URLs learn.ledgerback.xyz. If you have any questions, comments, or other feedback, send an email to ledgerback@gmail.com. You can send a direct message on Twitter to @ledgerback, or you can also post a message on the Ledgerback forum under the Introduction to the Data Cooperatives thread. Once again, I'm Charles Jovu, and I really want to thank you for listening in and looking at these lectures. Hopefully you've enjoyed them so far. Hopefully you enjoyed all the readings, and hopefully you come by for the next lecture.